a layperson's perspective on spiritually informed estate planning. All right. What I'd like to do is to first begin with why do we need a Christian perspective in talking about estate planning? How we treat what we have says what we believe about God. It's kind of like if someone gives you a present, how you treat that present says a lot about what you think about the person who gave it to you. And what we do with what we have provides insight into our relationship with the God who provided it. When we think about the theme for this conference, the idea of discovering the joy in the law, it reminds me of a scripture in 3 John 1:4. Says, I have no greater joy than to know that my children are walking in the truth. And the excitement of knowing that how we treat what we have and the stewardship of what we have lasts long beyond our lifetime. So what is stewardship? Stewardship is defined by the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics as a lifestyle. And I'll say that again, it's a lifestyle. Why do I say lifestyle? Lifestyle means how you live it out. How you live it out, how you experience life. It's a lifestyle that recognizes God is the owner of everything and describes us as caretakers of what God has provided. One of the scriptures that I like is Romans 12:2, and I want to read it to you from the Message translation because I think it really touches on this concept. It says, so here's what I want you to do, God, So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. This idea of stewardship goes along with us presenting our bodies as living sacrifices to God and understanding that our purpose is to manage the things that God has given us, that they're loaned to us. They are not ours, but they're given to us for a period of time. And as we think about estate planning, it's important for us to remember that as we look at these principles, that most financial advisors provide information on accumulating. They talk about protecting and also how to distribute wealth, but very few give you guidance on biblical principles or wisdom from the Bible. When we think about this act of stewardship that we have, it really is the last act of stewardship that we have. Our ability to manage what we have now and to plan for how things will be managed after we are gone is our last act of stewardship. There is the importance of thinking about the wisdom that comes from the Bible. We can have lots of information. We can know lots of facts and have lots of information. But there's a difference between intellectual knowledge and wisdom. And the ability to seek the Lord on how we are to use what He has given us, how we are to plan for what He has given us. The difference is that the world celebrates intelligence, and very seldom does it celebrate wisdom. There should be a prayer component in how we approach our estate planning. What do I mean by that? A prayer component meaning that we should go before the Lord and ask what is on His heart as far as what He desires for us to do with what we have, as opposed to coming with what we have and asking God to bless it. This concept is a concept throughout this entire presentation that I want you to think of as heaven down praying as opposed to earth up. The difference is I go before God and I make my request as opposed to going before God and asking Him what would He have me do, so that it's more directed from Him. We seek Him. The word says that He is the rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. And as we go before Him, He's able to give us insight. And He also says, call upon me and I will show you great and mighty things that you know not. So as we begin to seek His face, He begins to give us insight and direction on what He would have us to do with what we have. Some of the questions that have come up that we will address today are: what difference does a Christian perspective make in our decisions about estate planning and guardianship? In other words, does my Christian perspective change how I approach the task? Hence, prayer. How do I approach it? What examples do we find in Scripture about how to care for those we love after we're gone to be with the Lord? What principles are we putting in place? What examples do we see in Scripture? Another question we're going to ask is, how can we make our life's purpose evident in our plans? Can someone look at the plans that we have made and have a good idea of what type of person we were, of what our values were, of what we want to be caught after we are no longer here? Next is, what strategies? What strategies can we employ to make the transition smooth? That's always an issue. What strategies can we employ to facilitate the smooth transition of our desires? And how can we do that and help the family maintain the relationships that are there? That is key, because very often the relationships are strained after the death of a loved one, even in the handling of the estate. And how that is handled and how we deal with conflict should reflect who we are as Christians. And then, how can our gifts transform the lives of others? These are questions that we're going to look at and answer as we go throughout this workshop. Some of the principles that we're going to consider are, God provides guidance and instruction to us through the Bible. The Bible is our main instruction. It's going to give us an anchor for how to look at estate planning, an anchor for what the Word says about how we handle our finances and what we do with what we have. The Word says, to whom much is given, much is required. In other words, there's a great responsibility to manage what we have in such a way that it gives honor to God, that it blesses Him, and it's a blessing to others. We came into this world with nothing, and when we leave, we will take nothing with us. 1 Timothy 6:7. It's often been said, there is no U-Haul behind any hearse. You cannot take it with you. And anything that we are blessed with is because of the God we serve. He is the giver of every good and perfect gift. And we are held responsible for what we do with our talents, our wealth, our gifts, our time, and anything else God has given us. This perspective of stewardship, of knowing that it's not just our finances, it's everything that God has given us that we have to give an account for. It's how we manage our time. It's how we manage our resources. It's how we manage our talents. It's what we pour into the people that are around us. It's how we handle our influence. Those people that we have an ability to have influence upon, are we good stewards over that influence? And as we look at the review of the literature, the Princeton survey looked at 1,003 adults, and they asked them about estate planning and about plans for after their death. And only 42% of U.S. adults currently have estate planning documents. And for those under the age of 18, the percentage dropped to only 36%. So when we think about these statistics, you'd think that they are improving over time. But when we look at this graph for the study, 44% of Americans say they have a will that describes how they would like their money in the estate handled after their death. And that is lower than in the two prior Gallup polls. You'll see here it was 51% said no and 48% in 1990. Well, in 2006, 51% said yes and 48% said no. But when you look out at 2016, you see a big change there. It's now 55% say no and 44% say yes. And so you have to ask yourself, why the change? What are some of the reasons that these numbers are changing over time? Is it that people are too busy to think about it? Well, in looking at the research, one of the factors Could be possibly social and cultural issues. Social and cultural factors should be the graying of America. The graying of America, we're living longer. Living longer. There are growing levels of education. There's an increased number of women not having children. And the age at which people are beginning to make decisions and living longer. And of course, the amount of wealth that people have. And then when you look at the research, the research on American charitable bequest, the demographics indicate the following predictors of charitable estate transfers. They looked at several things, and in looking at these things, they considered them to be good indicators of charitable estate transfers. The three things that came to the top were a history of giving, absence of children, and reported wealth. So if you look at that, the history of giving means when they look at people who are looking at charitable estate transfers, if they're givers in their church, if they give to their university, if they have a habit of giving, if giving is in their DNA, then it's likely that they're going to be a person who's willing to give in this instance. The absence of children. Before you saw the statistic of the number of women who are living longer and not having children. Because there is an absence of children, the giving is to organizations, not necessarily to their children. And then the people who have reported wealth, who are more concerned about what is going to happen because they have more of it, which makes sense. Most people say the reason they don't have estate plans is they never got around to it. And the most important thing, I think, is kind of like a Nike commercial, is to just do it, to begin, and to update it regularly. Because once people do have an estate plan, very often they don't, especially with guardianship, they don't continue to make the updates and changes that they need to. So I want us to use this acronym START today to kind of jog your memory and to give you something to hold on to when you leave, to think about some Christian principles for estate planning. And I want to use START as a way of doing that. The idea of beginning, getting things started and beginning. So when we talk about beginning, the first thing we need to do is remember that there is a command. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. As we look at this, it tells us that we are to hope in wealth and to hope in God. Where do we put our hope when things are uncertain? Put our hope in God. And then it tells us to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. This makes us think about the principle of not doing, but being. What we think about our estate and what we want to do with our lives and what we have is not about doing, it's more about being. Our culture is designed to make us think that we are doers, but we are not. We are human beings, not human doings. So as we look at this, God says, do good, be rich in good deeds, and be generous and willing to share. It's an outline for how we as Christians are to live our lives, to give back, to share, and to be rich in good deeds, and generous and willing to share. He set the example for us in the scripture, because the Bible itself is God's very own written estate plan. It is his written estate plan, explaining what, how, and why he has provided for us. What, how, and why he has provided for us. Romans 8:17 says, now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. This idea of giving, that he has given us the perfect example of what it is we are to do in giving sacrificially, and giving back and caring for others, and being others focused. So as we look at our acronym, START, the S is for stewardship, T is for treasure, A is for accountability, R is for relationship, and T is for transformation. We've talked some about stewardship. When we talk about stewardship, it's looking at utilizing our resources for the kingdom of God, of allowing everything that we have to point to who He is in our lives in such a way that it gives glory to God. This can be seen in the idea of an attitude of stewardship. If we begin to think about everything we have belonging unto Him and that it is not ours, then that moves us to understanding that our treasure is something that we are willing to sacrifice, to give up. And as a result, we are accountable unto God with what we have and what we do with what we have. Therefore, it leads us into relationship. And relationship here is not, it's a vertical relationship and a horizontal relationship. So that when you're dealing with estates, you're dealing with that horizontal relationship between people, whether it's family members, organizations, and you're also dealing with the vertical relationship of your relationship with Christ. And as you deal with those relationships and what you do after you've had the right attitude, understand the value of the treasure and the sacrifice of it, the accountability and the relationship, then you are able to transform the world for Christ. How do we get from stewardship to transformation in our estate planning? The idea of estate planning moving us to a point where we're able to transform the world for Christ. Maybe it's creating relationships that can be mended. Maybe it's using it for the upbuilding and starting of something that's going to last long beyond our lifetime. Stewardship, treasure, accountability, relationship, transformation. Generational stewardship. Generational stewardship is not new. The work God does is never as small as one person. I promise the things that God is doing in your life are always connected to the lives of those that are around you. Generational stewardship. He desires to work generationally to move, change, and redeem a people. As we look at the Bible, there is evidence of how God continues to move from generation to generation. He even speaks about generation to generation. This is one of the reasons for generational lists in scriptures. You know those parts that you skip over. He begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. There's a purpose for that. God is looking at generational leadership. And if you think about your own personal life, I'm sure you can begin to understand and see how God is working, not in your generation only, but in the generation before you and in the generation after you. That there is a plan, and you're just part of that plan. You're just a piece of that puzzle. So as you are talking about estate planning, it's an opportunity for you to be able to step into generational change, to understand the impact that you will have on the generations who will be after you, and to be a good steward over what you have received from the generations who have come before you. And some of that can be very heavy if you really sit down and begin to process the responsibility of what you have. And it's not always monetary when you think about what you have received, okay, and what you are responsible to pass on to those who come. How do we see this? We see this in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We see it in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in good ways and in bad ways. We see it in bad ways when Abraham lied about his wife being his sister, and Isaac then again lies about his wife being his sister. But we also see that they pass down heritage. They pass down the idea of what God's law should be and how they should live that law. And then we look at David and Solomon. I like the idea of transfer from David to Solomon because there's some principles in that transfer that I think are important, that are an important part of estate planning, an important part of how we think about spiritual principles. The idea that David realized that something that he had a passion for, because he went before the Lord and wanted to build a temple. And God said to him, no, you've shed too much blood. It won't be for you, but it will be for your son to do. And at that point, he begins to prepare and to help Solomon to be able to carry forth and to complete that task. So the idea of preparing the next generation before you are no longer here for what it is you want them to sustain. And then the next thought is that David also introduced and let everybody else know that Solomon was going to succeed, be the successor, and that this was the task, so that there was clarity. That is also part of what we need to do with our families, is to be able to provide some clarity. So when I'm alive, you know exactly what my desire is, and that it is documented. So that when I am no longer here, it's not as if you don't know that this is what Solomon was supposed to do. Okay? So it was said publicly, and that he provided what was necessary. He made preparation for Solomon to fulfill a vision that was beyond his lifetime. What's the vision you have that's beyond your lifetime? What is it that you spent your life energy excited about and pouring into? How will it continue when you are no longer here? And is that evident to those that you love? Do they know it? Are they able to see it? Generational stewardship. Resources, passing down relationships and connections, as well as announcing succession and getting an understanding from everyone on this is what is going to happen. Another piece of generational stewardship that you can do, is just something that I have been doing, is to use my Bible as a way of creating notes. I took a new Bible and I decided that as I read through this Bible that I would write notes to my children and to the grandchildren that I don't have yet. So in the Bible, as I read it, if I see a passage, I begin to write the date and I write a note. So that, everything is becoming so electronic now, but I like the pages to be able to write those notes so that when my children pick up that Bible, they will see their names and notes that I've written to them. And that is generational stewardship. I'm passing on values. I'm passing on ideas, things that I want them to grasp and hold on to and pass on to their children. That idea of stewardship. This example I love. Focus on the Family has a gift and estate planning arm, and they use this example. It says, can you imagine attending an Olympic track and field event and watching as the very first runner on the relay team drops the baton just as he completes the segment of the race? Just drops it, doesn't even place it in the hand of the person who's next. It seems ludicrous that someone who's put years into training for this event would be so careless, that you would spend so much time training for a race, so much time preparing for this moment that you're going to run this race, that you would get to the very point where you're supposed to hand off to the next person, and rather than hand it, you just stand there and drop it. Okay? That's exactly what is happening. Millions of Americans are dropping the baton every day by not having an estate plan in place. They neglect to put in place an intentional transition plan for their earthly wealth. And as a result, they spend years acquiring and guarding their wealth only to carelessly drop the baton at the finish line. Not being able to go forward and pass on what you spent all your life building up. This principle of stewardship is evident throughout the Word. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, and they that dwell therein. Good stewardship is what? We talked about it. A lifestyle. It's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that has planning and investing and giving. Planning and investing and giving. And it seeks to responsibly use all God-given resources, our time, our talents, and our treasures in service to others for the purpose of bringing glory to the God that we love. That is our principle of stewardship. Next, we have our principle of treasure. Matthew 6:19 through 21 says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also." My grandmother used to say, "I'm sending up some timber," and I never really understood what that meant. I live in the South, and it's a Southern saying, and some of you may have never heard it before. But as she said, "I'm sending up timber," I understood it when I read this scripture. The idea of I'm doing something that has eternal value. I'm sending up some timber. I'm doing what I need to do here for when I'm no longer here. The idea of putting forth a treasure and working so that my heart is where my treasure is. And if your heart is where your treasure is your heart in a house? Is it in a boat? Is it in clothing? Is it in education? For where your treasure is, there your heart is also. The two go together. Where else do we see information about treasure in the scripture? The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. And for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has, and he buys that field. He's willing to make a sacrifice because of that type of joy. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he found one pearl of great price, went and sold all he had, and he bought it. Treasure. Treasure. Treasure that is worth sacrificing over. Treasure that is worth selling and sacrificing so that we are able to have something that has eternal value. We have to begin to focus on what matters long beyond the life that we have. This idea of sacrifice in the treasure principle is also seen in the book of Acts, when the believers shared their possessions. The believers were one in heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. Can you imagine a world where when you had extra, everything was given to those who didn't have enough? This idea of generosity and what we do with our surplus, what we do with the overflow of what we have. How do we think about it? How do we process that? With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them. All that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, bought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. And this is here because I want us to think about, as we provide for those that we love, that we're also called to provide for those that we may not even know. And as we plan our estates and we begin to think about giving, this idea of generosity means that we need to be able to give long beyond our lifetime into areas that can impact the kingdom. The kingdom is so valuable that it is worth sacrificing for. It's worth making the sacrifice. The treasure, we're called to give for the good of others, not just for those we know, but also for those who we may not know. When we think of giving, giving is Christ-like. It is what God did. It said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." The idea of giving, when we think of what he gives to us every day, the idea of giving. Our focus has to be on what is eternal, not on what is temporal. Focusing on the eternal versus the temporal. When we think of our treasure is something that has eternal value, something that can't be bought, that there is no price for it, that there's nothing that can be put on it, something that has eternal value. If we begin to think in terms of eternal value and our perspective is there, it changes how we use our time. Because what we do with our time is also stewardship. And does what we do have eternal value, or is it just a temporary thing for this place and this moment in time? Is it finite or is it infinite? Is it seen or is it unseen? Being able to allow ourselves to focus more on the right side than the left side. So it transitions what we do with our time. It also impacts our relationships. We become more intentional in our relationships and realize that our relationships in our estate planning and what we do for our families and how we build those relationships should have eternal value so that we're sharing Christ. And next, the A is accountability. So we've talked about stewardship. We've talked about treasure, which is the T, and start. And now we're talking about accountability. Accountability. If stewardship is the attitude we have, and treasure is what we are responsible for doing with what we have, then accountability is when God asks us, when he comes back and we have to give an account for what we've done, what will our answer be? 1 Corinthians 4:2, now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. Again, we're back to whom much is given, much is required. To whom much is given, much is required. Good stewardship is taking responsibility and being accountable for everything God has entrusted to us. There are lots of parables that talk about what happens when God comes back and he asks, what have you done with what I have given you? How accountable are we? Accountability. In Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, the parable of the talents. The master returns and calls the servants to give an account for what he has entrusted to them. Whether he's given them 5 talents, 2 talents, or just 1 talent. The accountability. This is important because people often say the reason I don't have an estate plan is that I don't have a lot. But if we are to be accountable and we're dealing with this idea of principle of accountability, then it's important that no matter what we have, large or small, that we will have to give an account for it. And it will not be great if everything goes to the state. Okay? We want to hear him say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Right? The parable of the talents. Accountability. In Romans 14 and 12, it says, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. And faithfulness to God's call is even beyond our lifetime. When you think about faithfulness to God's call being beyond your lifetime, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to be faithful beyond the time you are here? It means what have you done to prepare those who will be here after you are gone? Through your planning, through your teaching, through your nurturing, through your discipleship. Faithfulness to that call. It lasts long beyond the time when we are here. And this accountability, scripture in Matthew 25, let's stay here for just a minute. It says, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison and go to visit you. The king will reply, truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. It's stretching ourselves to be accountable, not just to our loved ones, but for those that we see that are in need. And that question that's there, is there some group, is there some passion, is there some organization that capsulizes what your life has been about that you'd like to give to? This idea of helping the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, those who are needing clothes, of giving beyond ourselves. Accountability, accountability. And the R, relationship. Relationship. Legacy-wise has a saying, when we look at legacy-wise, the idea of it matters who raises our kids and how our money is spent after we're gone. The idea of relationship, making relationships. Part of our legacy is our family. Our family is our legacy. So make every effort to plan in such a way that the family remains intact. And I say this, and this is difficult. I think this is one of the challenges in sitting in Dr. Bowser's class, listening about what happens when estate plans are done and trying to keep families intact. One of the indicators of a well-planned estate is if the family, children, and grandchildren are still communicating and even hugging 6 months after the death of a loved one. 6 months after the loved one is gone, is the family still able to love, still able to share, still able to care for one another? The love that needs to exist within that family. Relationship, relationship. I'm going to share a little bit later about my family and the relationships and the importance of talking about what's going to happen when the loved one is no longer here, of helping create relationship prior to the death of a loved one, when you know there's going to be a problem. Because in some families, you know that a problem exists because it exists prior to the death of the loved one. And how do we handle that? And how do we show Christ in that relationship? Are we really ministers of reconciliation? Or do we just say that? Are we able to bridge the gap? Are we able to deal with conflict resolution in such a way that God is glorified? We see it in Scripture. Luke 12:13-15. Someone in the crowd said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replies, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to him, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Motives become very evident when money is at stake. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. You notice it says all kinds of greed, as in multiple types, not just one. And being able to understand the division of the inheritance. Tell my brother to divide the inheritance. What are the motives? Are we able as Christians to be able to talk to people in such a way that we can discern motives and provide input in a way that is healing to relationships and not hurtful to relationships? That allows people to join together and to work together to solve problems, to understand how to, in a healthy way, resolve conflict in a family. That is important. We have to be able to get there. We have to be able to get there. And if we as Christians are not able to do it, I've seen Christian families torn up over the death of a loved one and the division of an estate. It is the principle of relationship, how we relate to each other and how we relate to Christ. The vertical relationship is what allows us to have the horizontal relationship. The vertical relationship of being secure in who we are in Christ and knowing our value and knowing that we have been redeemed. allows us to be able to then relate to others in such a way that we're able to give them grace. How much grace do you give yourself? How much grace do you give other people? Even in conflict resolution, how much grace are you able to extend to those who don't think like you, to those who don't look like you, to those who have different ideas than you? The idea of relationship. Principle of relationship continued. All the believers were one in heart and in mind. No one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they shared everything they had. The difference between greed and sharing is the contrast that I want you to see between these two. This concept of relationship that allows us to understand generosity and sharing as opposed to greed and self-centeredness. Where is my peace? Where is mine? What about me? How did I get left behind? And being sensitive to that as Christians as we share and as we work with people in estate planning. Guardianship. How we plan the care of those we love takes intentionality to provide more than just physical care, but spiritual nurturing. I noticed in the workshop before me that this is an area where people will get everything done and get to the point where they can't make a decision about who should be the guardian for their child or their children. And sometimes that is because they, as Christian parents, want a Christian environment, and family may not be that choice. Okay? This is going to require a lot of thought, a lot of prayer, but definitely needs to be done. What happens is it gets left undone. And as a result, children are left, we'll talk about someone famous later that happened to, not making plans. And it's important to remember to update those plans, to constantly update those plans. You have the ability to change. When my children were very little, we made a decision that if something happened, my husband and I travel on mission trips very often. And when both of us were going to be in Africa for an extended period of time, we thought if something happens and we don't get back, what's going to happen with the kids? And we made some arrangements to plan who would we want to care for our children. And there was a couple who is not related to us, not a brother or a sister or related to us in any way, that we made a decision that if something should happen, we wanted this couple to raise our children. That was when they were very little. As they began to become in their 10, 12, 13, 14 age range, the couple is getting very old. And the thought of that couple having the longevity and the ability to deal with our children was different. So we began to make some adjustments and changes. And we ended up with godparents who take our children on vacation, who actually will take them every Thanksgiving to the beach. And that's the change that we made. And then it occurred to me that my oldest child is now turning 18. So you know, the changes and the planning, it's a continual process. And I think when we think about being good stewards, it's not something that we do and we're just done with it. That it's a continual process of being aware of how things are changing, how our values are changing. What is important to us changes over time. What we want for our children and where they are and what we know that they need changes. So being prayerful, again, the prayer process is heaven down, not earth up. It's not, this is what I want, this is the way it's going to be. It's, God, what is on your heart for my kids? What environment would you want them to be in? Where do you see them thriving? And I listen for the Lord to speak. And then I make a decision about what's going to happen with my children. So how we plan the care of those we love, it takes intentionality. We have to be very intentional, and we have to be persistent. Our elderly care and special needs addressed. I'm not going to get into this, but in talking with friends and nurses, I'm finding that very often people who are responsible for taking care of elderly parents or and some of the attorneys in here may comment, whether it's parents or aunts or uncles, are more concerned about the money than they are about the care of the loved one. And is that good stewardship? And is that kind for us to be more concerned about the money than we are about the person? What does that say about our relationship with Christ and how we treat what he has given us? So our values are what come into play when we think about guardianship. So it's not just physical care, and it's not just financial care. It's spiritual nurturing. It's preparing them and setting them up to handle life in a way that financially is secure, physically is safe, but spiritually is able to impact their lives in such a way that there's an eternal impact that is made. A lot of people worry about giving too much to their children. These are some quotes that I like. Warren Buffett, he says, "I want to give my children enough so that they can do anything they want, but not so much that they do nothing." Okay? It's finding that balance between not providing so much that they do absolutely nothing, but you want them to be able to have what's necessary to be able to dream and to make some changes in their lives. And then Os Guinness says, "Today our children have too much to live with and not enough to live for." Too much to live with and not enough to live for. So our values and being able to make some decisions on what type of stipulations would I want on giving to my children, what type of management of the finances, how much freedom, all at once or over time, making those types of decisions and understanding the stewardship implication that you are now placing on the child. Okay? And is that child mature or equipped enough to handle it? Or is there training, are there classes that you desire? What needs to happen in order for there to be good management? Sharing God's gifts to us connects us with others. Relationship, horizontal and vertical. How I treat others, how God and I interact impacts how I treat others. And God is able to impact others because of how I am treated. It is a constant back and forth arrow. Okay? My interaction with others says how I feel about God. God's interaction to me impacts how I treat others. So understanding our responsibility in relationships. And in relationships, we have to be able to manage conflict. How do we manage conflict? How you live your life from this point forward and how you structure your estate at death are new opportunities to reinforce the healthy aspects of your family, to correct past wrongs, and to leave a lasting legacy of fairness, compassion, and love. Now that sounds great, but putting that into practice is very different. It's kind of like my 14-year-old who's taking driver's ed. I think 14 is way too young. But she's learning all the stuff that's in the book, and she knows all the rules, all the regulations. She can make 100 on the test. But getting behind the wheel of a car is another thing altogether. Being able to put what you know on the road is a different experience. Okay? So head knowledge versus application. Here we're talking application, and what this application looks like and how it is walked out can be difficult. It can be very difficult. When you're talking about reinforcing healthy aspects of your family, correcting past wrongs sounds good, but if it's been there for 20 years, it's not going to change in a day. Leave a lasting legacy of fairness, compassion, and love. Fairness is not a term that everybody interprets the same. What one person thinks is fair, another person may not. So how do we manage that? How do we deal with conflict? How do we handle conflict? And looking at conflict, there are some emotional areas that we have to be able to deal with. There are 5 emotional blocks that come up in dealing with conflict. And the first is the big D word, death, is being in contact with our own mortality. People don't want to think about death. It's an emotional roadblock. They don't want to deal with it. So when you want to talk to someone, I have my mother's best friend who is in her late 80s. She approached me and wants to sit down and talk with me about her estate planning. And I was like, why won't you talk to your son? Every time I try to talk to my son about this, he goes, oh, I don't want to hear about you dying. Okay? So being able to move beyond that emotional block of the D word. And 2, giving up control. Knowing that, yes, I cannot take it with me, and I won't be able to control what happens with it totally when I am gone. And then 3, this is going to surprise you. The next emotional roadblock that people have is the fear of dealing with an attorney. That made me smile. There was even a phobia assigned to it. And 4, cost. This is going to cost a lot. And 5, family ties. So emotional blocks, the D word, giving up control, dealing with an attorney, the cost, and the family ties, those are emotional roadblocks that we have to overcome in order to be able to talk honestly and openly about estate planning. To be able to make decisions and to make them in advance. It's necessary to have that time and to have those conversations and to manage conflict. Many of the problems of inheritance are in themselves inherited. What does that mean? That means that they are both genetic and acquired, but they are not inevitable. Inheritance disputes can be explained and predicted and are to a large degree preventable. By carefully and thoughtfully planning your estate, you can protect your most important legacy. Again, concept, walking it out looks very different. Being able to walk it out. Being able to look at things a little differently. And I'll jump ahead because I want to make sure I get a chance to share a personal story dealing with this idea of conflict management. When I was in college, my parents divorced and my mother remarried. My father became ill. He had multiple sclerosis and he moved in with my grandmother. And I moved back to Charlotte to help care for him. During this time, the divorce was very amicable. A lot of the discussion about what would happen with the things that they shared, they put in my name and my brother's name. So the house that my parents lived in, the majority of the house went to my brother and I. And that was very clear to everyone. My mother, when I was pregnant with my second child, had a lung cancer diagnosis. At the time of the diagnosis, I remember asking them on the sonogram to put high Mima for the little embryo, to give her a reason just to press on a little bit longer. But during that time, before the baby was born, she was very intent on making sure everything was planned the way she wanted it, and she wanted to sit down with the family and communicate it. Of course, some people were like, we don't want to hear it, but she was very insistent. She took care of all her funeral arrangements, she did her plot, and while she was very healthy. And she sat down and said she wanted to have a family meeting. And at the family meeting, she said, these are my wishes, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that these are my wishes. She said, my wish is that my husband and I live in this house, but at the time of the divorce, the house was to go to the children. So the house will go to the children. She named me as her health care power of attorney and not her husband, which did create problems, as you can imagine. And I also was the executor for the estate. Her husband was very upset about this. My stepfather, I loved my stepfather. We had a great relationship. But at this point, with her still living and very, very healthy, he made known that he was not happy. She said, we can continue to talk about it, but this is what my wishes are. So not only did she share these wishes with her family, but she also shared these wishes with her closest friends. And as time began to go on, she continued to talk about what her plans were, and they were in writing. She went over them in writing, made sure everybody had a copy of what it is she wanted. And when my mother passed away, everything went crazy, because my stepfather decided that he wanted to contest the will. He claimed that at the point of her death that she wrote something different. And he produces this piece of paper saying that it doesn't look like her handwriting because she was sick, and that her wishes were changed at the time of her death. And I end up in court in a situation that I thought was not going to, I thought it was just going to be very clear and straightforward, because it had been clear and straightforward all along. I go to my family home and I can't get in. All the locks have been changed on the house. I'm confused. I call, I say, hi, I'm trying to get into the house. He says he's not letting me in and he will see me in court. I'm very confused. At this point, I can no longer grieve over the loss of my mother, because now I'm dealing with the craziness that is now happening in my family. Craziness that should have been avoided because of all the decisions that were made on the front end. I say this because as we go into court, I finally get permission to get into the house. When I get into the house, and I'm actually able to talk about this now, I'm at a whole new place, and that's only God. I'm able to get into the house, but everything in the house is gone. The furniture is gone. The light fixtures are ripped off the wall. Everything's not there. And at this point I am crying, because I grew up in this house. And there were things that had emotional attachment to me, not just physical or monetary. So in the court proceedings, this goes on. I finally get to the point where I say to the attorney, you know what? Tell him to just keep the stuff. The house does belong to us. He can't prove it. Handwriting expert says, no, this is not her handwriting. The house comes back to us. But all the stuff that he took, if he wants it that bad, just let him keep it. It's really not that big a deal. I just asked that he would return my family movies and my family cookbook. Because at the end of the day, it's about legacy. It's about what she gave me that he could never take away. This is not in a sofa. It's not in a picture that was on the wall. It's a heritage. It's a legacy of faith. It's a legacy of educational and the value of an education. It's the legacy of knowing how to treat people and to take the high road, of being able to look at myself and say that these things were not more important to me than my mother was. Okay? So the resolution was, my brother and I got the house. We sold the house and split the money. My stepfather moved into a condo, and she left a significant amount of money for him to be able to do those things. I got back the cookbook, and I did not get back my family videos. So to this day, I don't. But I have to tell you that through the process, God used it to create in me a new awareness of what it means to forgive, to be able to let go, to be able to take the high road and allow him to do a transformative work in me. And this work took 10 years for me to get to. It's not an easy process. 10 years later, I walk into the grocery store and he's there, and I can actually have a conversation and hug him and be concerned about his health, about how he is doing, to be in contact with him and to have a relationship. And that is only God's doing. Because if we are to live a Christian life, we have to be able to manage conflict in such a way that honors God, in such a way that gives him glory, that allows other people to see, because everybody was aware of what was going on. My mother's friends, his friends, everyone. And how will, knowing that I am a Christian, a pastor's wife, how is she going to handle this? How is she going to deal with this? Okay? And it really took me being able to let go and to understand what that chart of what has eternal value and what has temporal value. what has eternal value and what has temporal value. So our relationships are important, and how we handle conflict is important. So I shared this. My grandmother, my father moving in with my grandmother was really my first experience in dealing with estate planning. I am the oldest of two. My brother is 6 years younger, and my grandmother left me as the person responsible for everything. And it was very simple. My grandmother lived to be 92. And at that point, I began to understand what I needed to do and how I needed to do it. But I also realized that because she was 92, she was still renting her telephones. So my awareness of what's happening prior could have been much better. So when we're talking with our loved ones, being aware of what they currently have going on is just as important as knowing what's going to happen afterwards. I didn't think people could still rent telephones. She was renting her telephone. And then I have a brother-in-law who died at 39. My brother-in-law lived in New York and had just a love for New York. When my brother-in-law became ill, there were so many different women who showed up to the hospital who were the girlfriend that it was confusing. It created a lot of problems for my husband because he kept having to keep the women away from each other. He had taken some of his sperm and put it into a sperm bank because he is the only natural child of my husband's stepfather and mom, and there are no offspring. So he decided that he would put his sperm in the sperm bank. And he left in his will that if his father decided at any point that he wanted a grandchild, that he could use that sperm to have a kid. Oh, what a nightmare. It was a nightmare. And I think the entire time, we just kept trying to convince my husband's father, my husband's stepfather, that this was not a good idea, because which one of these women would you choose? And then you're linked to that person for the rest of your life, and then there are financial implications. So last week, my husband pulls the will out again because he's beginning to have these conversations with his father again about this sperm that's been in this bank. And he says, look, in the will it says if this amount of time passes, he cannot do it, and the time has passed. He cannot have access to the sperm. But these kinds of things create major complications, and I'm sure you've heard more in the work that you do. But being able to think and plan ahead in such a way that you're able to have these discussions. He never discussed with us that he had even done this. Okay? It came as a total shock and a total surprise. I just know that when my husband decided to have a vasectomy, he came in and he was in an uproar because he said, there will be no offspring. I don't have children. My sister cannot have children. And if he doesn't have any more, there will be no more. I said, there will be no more. And at that point, I think this was his decision as an option for what could happen. But being able to have conversations and to discuss and to know what people's wishes are, even when you don't like them. I think in our situation, in our family, knowing the wishes, even though you don't like them. My stepfather, he knew, but he just didn't like it. He didn't like what the instructions were, but he was aware. And as a result, everybody else knew. And so at the time of the conflict, being able to help process it was a lot easier for me. A lot easier for me. And then my mother-in-law currently has Alzheimer's, and she lives with my husband's stepfather, and he's a physician, and he provides 24-hour nursing care for her in the home. And being able to see someone not remember makes us think that we have to have these discussions long before people are no longer competent enough to make the decisions. Don't put it off. Make the decisions now. And our last principle is the principle of transformation. Spiritual principles for estate planning and guardianship have the power to transform. What do I mean by that? Transformation. The ability to have an impact that reverberates throughout history. Making a decision to give your money to start a foundation that impacts the lives of children that you'll never see. Transformational. Planning for grandchildren to receive education can be transformational. Thinking about who's going to care for those that you love can transform their lives in a healthy environment. The transformation of a life. We serve a God who specializes in transformation. He is a transforming God. He transforms. The miracles of transformation. He can turn water into wine. He can take something that is not and say it is, and there it appears. Transformation. What are you doing that can transform someone else's life? Are you investing what you have now in such a way that it can be transformational? The stewardship of opportunity, relationship, and treasure can impact the world for Christ. You can think about relationships that have been transforming for your own life. People who've had an impact on you. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe it was a mentor. Maybe it was a pastor. A transformational relationship. How are you stewarding the relationships that you have, and how will you do that in what you plan for those you love? They will know us by our love. It's love that we have to show. Love in giving, love in sharing, love in extending grace. Love covers a multitude of sins. When we think about how we express love, what does it look like for you to show love? Is it more than just a monetary gift? Is there more attached to it? What we give has the power to transform. Money for a well in Kenya. Transformational. Transformational. How we treat others is transformational. I wonder what would have happened had I not gotten to the point with my stepfather where I said, you know what? Whatever you have, just keep. Yes, it took 10 years for the relationship to get back to becoming a relationship, but how worse would it have been? His grandchildren and my children hang out together. It's the mending of a generation. Okay? Would it have been that way? Would they have even known his grandchildren? All right. They're at the same high school now. When I take lunch for one, I take lunch for the other. It's the mending of a generation. It's love. And it has to be shown, not just talked about. They will know us by our love, by what they see. Start. This takes us back to where we were. You are the catalyst to lead and guide someone to see Jesus and share Jesus in their handling of what God has given them. How will you start? How will you start not just in the lives of the people that you serve, but how will you start in your own life? The question is, will you begin to make a difference? Will you begin to show that there's something more than just what's on paper? Will you extend a legacy and be legacy-wise? Let's answer some questions. I want to open it up for questions and discussion. What type of legacy do you want to leave behind for your loved ones? How much is enough? Are you accumulating without preparing? What is your purpose and passion, and how do you want it continued? I love this question, and I want us to actually open up and share a little bit, and for you guys to ask questions back. What is your purpose and passion? Are there things that you're passionate about? Yes?
Are you talking about ethical will? Have you heard of those before? You pass on your values instead of your assets?
Well, I think that you could do both.
The only thing I'm worried about is sometimes precatory language, and somebody who wants to contest it will say, hey, that language was meant for me, and he left me out, so now I'm going to use that discussion or whatever dad or mom said about a situation to say they meant to include me but forgot about me. That's the only, I was just wondering if you ever dealt with that issue before.
I'm not an attorney.
Well.
Dr. Bowser, would you like to?
I mean, I understand that all facts, wherever their sources, can be used by a variety of different people for a variety of different purposes. And so sometimes the letter that's written to the children, sometimes described as an ethical will, saying because of these circumstances, this is what I'm trying to communicate, this happened, etc., can be used to show some kind of whatever it might be. Undue influence, some kind of animus, whatever it might be. If that's not accurate, then there's some potential for contesting. However,
it's a great way to pass values on those.
well, that's what I was going to say.
Right.
However, I think you do it anyway.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I think you live with that risk.
What's interesting is when you write these values down and say, I remember when you were 7 and you liked to do this, and here you are at 35 and doing this. The fight becomes, I want that document. I can hear my mom or my dad. I can hear their voice. I said, we'll get you a copy. No. And I go, why do you want to fight about this?
No.
But they want the meetings. The document means more than any assets. And it's usually a time when they're really going to listen. Because they're all ready for something. And so they get the value and the asset.
I've seen the idea of, at the beginning, being able to, I think before, is it true that a last will and testament, the testament part was kind of a statement of what your life was about? Is that true?
No.
No?
It makes for a really nice story, but no.
No?
What's
Okay.
interesting is there's a you can go to a website, Ethical Will. They'll put you through a certification program. You don't have to be an attorney to do it, but they'll kind of show you how to do that, how to prompt, because these questions are right in line with what they say, how to prompt thinking. And what's interesting is you'll ask a 20-year-old, what do you want your kids to know? And the 20-year-old will write out 20 pages. And the 30-year-old writes 17, 40-year-old 10, 50-year-old 4 or 5, 70-year-old says 1 page. He says, trust Jesus.
Yeah.
Nothing else I can tell you. You got to figure it out yourself. But it's interesting. You think the other way around. You go the other way around.
No, that is interesting. I like the fact.
But anybody can do it. It's a great little package to kind of set yourself out different. And there's a whole program at it. It's like $10. You can even tell your clients, go do this yourself.
I like my Bible, where I write my notes, and that way they can actually take it and they'll have it. Back there, question?
Well, that question, comment. So my grandfather did a lot of genealogy, and I kind of did too, but we have a lot of last wills and testimonies through the generation.
Oh.
And it's very interesting to get their perspective, and we actually put it in our own documents, and the first 2 to 3 paragraphs was our statement of faith. And then vision of what we want to pass down to the next generation. So it really was centering around Christ. And that was very common back hundreds of years. So.
That's priceless.
We have it from the 1800s, 1700s, and I even have a 1600s.
Really?
Hebrew,
That's
it's
priceless.
Hebrew tradition to pass on the values.
Yeah.
It's a Hebrew tradition.
Yeah.
They started it a long time ago.
That is priceless. Other questions, comments?
I just want to comment. I've been doing estate planning for 30 years and practically begging my clients to do ethical wills and statements of faith, and few do. You want to take the time to do it.
Why do you think that? What you have a reason when you think that happens?
Some of them have to do with the reasons you gave. About, I think a lot of our clients are just busy and don't take the time to do it.
Start. They just need to start.
I think there's some guidance issues too, because I looked a little bit into the web. I don't know if there's any good website or any good examples.
Yeah.
And I give them a copy of the first page of my own will. As an example, because they borrow from some of these statements.
So do they do the will, they just don't do the faith statement?
Right. Right.
It is interesting. It is interesting.
Cares more about the value statements and the faith statements
Yeah.
than they do any of the assets. I mean, I'm talking boats, cars, houses, they all want to keep hearing that part.
Yeah. We even put samples of faith statements for people who we know are committed Christians. Examples in the templates, of the drafts of the documents. A lot of the clients leave those in, but if we didn't put them in, they wouldn't be in the wills to begin with.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't be there.
But it's good that you're leading them in that direction. You're providing that as an option. I don't think that that's common practice. It just seems like people are focused more on monetary and things than they are about values.
Part of it, though, you have they'll come to the attorneys. I came here to get legal work done, not a sermon. I come back and say, well, you know who I am, and you're getting both.
Right. Well, and that's good stewardship of your influence. And because if you don't, where else are they going to get it? You know, where else?
By the same token, for people who seek us out because we are Christians,
Right.
I believe they deserve a Christian response.
I agree. That's
They
exactly right.
deserve more than just our knowledge about the law. And so we incorporate provisions. We have about a half-page directive about raising children in Christian values in the guardianship section.
That's excellent.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I consider that part of my responsibility.
Yeah. In the
Another
back.
thing, you had shown the baton going to the next generation. I kind of envision it as each generation gave our arms around each other. So I have my responsibility to the young ones, the grandbabies, and the children, and the parents. And then that next generation. So it's, and also in the scriptures it talks about Old Testament where they would stack stones.
Yes. Stones of remembrance.
Stones of remembrance, and it's so important for each of those generations to share with one another what did God do in our lives at different points, and have those remembrances throughout the generations.
And I think we need to be intentional about providing opportunities for that to happen. Passing down the legacy of what the family values over time. We do that every year, the week between Christmas and New Year's. We meet at our home and we invite people to come in and we talk about various principles that our family values. And then we talk about people who are no longer with us that embody those principles. So that the children who are living get to hear the stories about, because when my mother did pass, she passed after my daughter turned 1. My youngest was 1, and she passed away. She gets to hear stories about her Mima, who she never really got to know. To hear, her passion for education, to be able to hear, the things that she did, and, going back to school as an adult and becoming a principal and, mentoring other teachers. And they're not going to know those things unless we share them. And to hear the faith stories, this is our faith point. This is what happened, and the situation was really bad, and this is how God worked in this situation. Because if they don't see how God worked in the history of the family, they can't begin to see and understand how real He is to them, especially for kids. Good. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I just wanted to share what my husband's law firm did. In fact, the head of the law firm is actually a pastor himself, but they networked with the churches and offered just simple wills for like $300 or something, and went and met at the churches. And so there's some people that have more, and then that didn't count with that, but really kind of taking care of the church in these simple wills, and actually getting laughs. I've met so many people, that need people, and so, they weren't making any money on it, but, so they did, I think, 700 wills.
Wow. We do something called Prepare. My church is the Park Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and every year we have a workshop called Prepare. And the Prepare workshop is a panel discussion. We bring in estate planners, we bring in people from the cemetery, we bring in people dealing with extended care nursing home care. We just have everybody who you would need in one space, and they come, and it's a whole day, and people share, and they talk about how do you prepare? What do you do to prepare? And our senior citizens usually come out in big numbers, but our entire church has to be involved in planning it and all come out to be a part of it and learning how to follow these ideas of starting. Just get started in the process. And as you get started, looking at what your values are, beginning to think of stewardship and your treasure and how you're going to be accountable and how you are responsible for what you have. And then being able to transform, make a transformational statement by your life. Okay. Other questions? We got 5 minutes. You sure? Okay. All right, well, you guys have been great. Thank you so much for your time.